Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of History 101, where we take a brief look at some aspect of history. Today we're looking at the ranks of nobility. So let's get started. The term nobility or noble is one that has been around for hundreds of years, and it refers to a person who belongs to the upper class or the ruling class of a society. They are generally descended from an ancient line of rulers and hold some form of hereditary title, such as a duke, duchess, baron, baroness, etc. Throughout Europe, there were various titles and ranks which determined the level of nobility of a person and the privileges they had. But these differed depending on where you were in Europe. This was because although the continent was largely Christianized by this point and spoke mostly Romance languages derived from Latin, each kingdom was still very much its own thing and developed their own particular traditions and customs. Nevertheless, there were some similarities between them all. In France, the highest rank below the king was that of a royal prince or princess, usually a son or daughter of the king. Then came the three ranks of peerage, the duke or duchess, the count or comtesse, and the viscount or vicomte. The last two were sometimes called a pair or pair of France, which may sound familiar, as the modern French unit of measurement is based on this. The English equivalent of this were the ranks of an earl or earl, a viscount or viscountess, and a baron or baroness. These were originally granted by a king to reward great service or to show favor. It was not uncommon for someone to be given the title of baron when they financed the king's campaign or aided him in some other way. Once the king was indebted to you to such an extent, he would often reward you with the title of baron, but nothing more than that. This was because the king would not want anyone else to become too powerful and challenge his authority. Therefore, he would ensure that any grants of nobility would not advance someone beyond the rank of baron. As an example of this, when Richard the Lionheart, the legendary medieval warrior, was offered the throne of England, he declined it, saying that he did not wish to become a king and have his hands full with administrative work, when he could earn more glory by fighting in the Crusades. He also said that being a king meant that he would have to put up with people calling him my king, your king, or our king, whereas if he remained a baron, he would always be Richard the Lionheart. Below the ranks of peerage there were then the knights of the realm, which included both those who had received knighthood for their personal merit and those who held hereditary titles of lesser nobility, such as a lord or lady. Finally, at the lowest level of the nobility were the bourgeois, or middle class. They were merchants, professionals, and skilled craftsmen who were considered to be higher than the commoners, or peasants who made up the third estate. In France, these various ranks of nobility would often be referred to as the three orders of society, with the clergy making up the first order, the nobility the second, and the commoners the third. In Germany, the situation was a little different. There were three main ranks below the emperor: the elector, the prince, and the count. Electors were a rank above princes, and were those who had the right to vote for the Holy Roman Emperor. The electors were usually archbishops or abbots of important monasteries, dukes, kings, or princes of the church. There were 5 electorates: the Archbishopric of Mainz, the Archbishopric of Cologne, the Duchy of Saxony, the Kingdom of Bohemia, and the Margraviate of Brandenburg. As to why exactly these 5 and no others, well, it's complicated and has to do with several power struggles throughout the previous centuries between the Frankish kings and the popes, and also between the various contenders to the throne after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Anyway, the electors formed a sort of collegiate monarchy together and effectively controlled the imperial title. So don't think that being elected Holy Roman Emperor was quite as simple as winning an election. Although the emperor was elected, he was not above the electors. Instead, he was one of their number and was treated as an equal. At times, the emperors didn't even have much power within their own territories, and were reliant on the good graces of the electors to maintain their position. Back in England, in the year 926, King Athelstan defined the ranks of nobility in the laws of Athelstan. First, there were the Earls, or Earls, which was the English equivalent of the continental duke. Then came the Charles, or Thanes, which were equivalent to a continental count or viscount. Finally, there were the Charles Friand, which were the king's friends, or barons. Under them were the knights, then the esquires, then the yeomen, then the husbandmen, and finally the laborers. This system was later taken over by the Normans after their conquest of England in 1066, and like the English before them, the Normans also had a system of 5 ranks of nobility. The highest rank was that of a royal prince or princess, usually the eldest son or daughter of the king. Next came the duke, then the earl, then the viscount, and finally the baron. In Scotland, the equivalent ranks were those of a thane, a lord, a deputy, and a baron. Another point of difference can be seen in how women were addressed in the various countries. In England, a married woman was known as a lady, whilst in Scotland she would be called a landess. Furthermore, in Scotland, a woman could keep her title when she married and pass it down to her children. Whereas in England, upon marriage, a woman would take on the title of her husband. In Russia, there were 6 ranks of nobility: bojar, the prince, the count, the viscount, the baron, and the roturier. In Spain, there were 4 ranks: the duke, the marquess, the count, and the viscount. And in Sweden, there were 5 ranks: that of a king, a duke, a prince, a count, and a baron. One similarity between many of these different systems was that the lowest rank of nobility was often that of a baron or baroness. This was because the word baron came from the Frankish word baro, meaning man. So it literally means men of rank. Also, it was not uncommon for people to be given the title of baron when they financed a king's campaign or aided him in some other way. This was because the king would not want anyone else to become too powerful and challenge his authority. Therefore, he would ensure that any grants of nobility would not advance someone beyond the rank of baron. Throughout most of medieval history, a title of nobility was usually hereditary. This meant that if a man was an earl, his sons would also be earls, and so on and so forth. However, in France, there was a curious situation whereby a title was held by the king and could be removed at any time. The king would then grant the title to whomever he wanted. For example, when Henry II was about to invade Ireland, he asked Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury, to go with him as his counselor and gave him the title of Earl of Wiltshire for the duration of the trip. When Becket died in 1170, Henry II took the title of Earl of Wiltshire back for himself. This practice became known as a royal gratia. Something else to note about titles of nobility was that they usually related to a specific area or region. For example, an earl or earl was the ruler of a county, whilst a duke or duchess ruled over a duchy. Sometimes, though, a noble might hold a title which reflected their personal achievements. For example, in France, there were many nobles who held the title of chevalier or knight. And in England, there were many nobles who held the title of Lord Chancellor or Lord Treasurer. Something else to remember is that these titles were not only used in Europe, but wherever the Europeans went, such as in the British colonies of North America and the Dutch colony of South Africa. Also, titles of nobility were used in Japan and China. So that is the end of our brief overview of the ranks of nobility. Please feel free to leave any comments you might have down below. Now, if you enjoyed this video, please feel free to check out my others. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all next time.